Thank you all for attending today's session titled The ROI of Business Analytics. My name is Othniel Denis, and I run a company called Excellent Ones Consulting, and we'll be talking about ROI for a little bit. So before we get started, please silence your cell phones. That'll help us as we go throughout this presentation. So in terms of agenda for today, we'll be talking about a few things. We'll be talking about ROI, what is it really, how do we define it? And from there, we'll talk about the science of ROI calculations. So we'll go into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the mechanics behind this analysis. Then we'll move into somewhat of the softer side, right? What's really the more creative components of ROI calculations and how this impacts these BI projects or this business analytic projects. So we'll go through a few case studies and touch upon some common pitfalls and best practices. So the business analytic landscape is changing rapidly, right? There's more data available. I think in the keynote this morning, it talked about the amount of data that's available to us that's being produced every day in comparison to how much was created from the beginning of time to a certain point. So we're getting more and more data, and it's a challenge to analyze that data. But there's more to that landscape than just that. Roughly 85% of Fortune 500 companies are unable to exploit big data. There's data available everywhere. Right? And they can't really grasp their arms around it and understand what all of this really mean. What are the insights that we can gain from this? Data savvy managers. Every organization needs data savvy managers, 10 times more than data scientists. So everybody has to be data fluent. Everybody has to understand the numbers. Everybody has to be able to interpret the numbers. It's not just for people who are engineers. It's not just for the technical folks. Everyone has to be fluent in that respect. It's just the nature of the environment that we live in now. And finally, 41.5 billion is anticipated to be generated by 2018 within this space, these big data technology space, this big data technology space. So that's business analytic projects, that's cloud computing, that's mobile. All of these things are estimated to have this sort of value in just a few years, right? So just to quickly summarize, we have an environment that has data that's very fragmented. People can't really grasp or really understand what's going on because it's so disparate, the data. We have an environment where people who can understand data, analyze it, digest it, and recommend actions from that data, those people are really needed and important to have in every organization. And we have the potential for this space, right? The potential in terms of what value this can actually generate for a company and for countries, the world, quite frankly. A few more highlights. IBM, I think I mentioned this before, right? $40 billion estimated for these spaces by 2018. A few companies like Burst and Looker who generated a certain amount in funding, right, because of the types of things that they can do with their software. So this is the space that we're talking about, the space that we live in. So before we get to these types of returns, before we get to that valuation that we talked about a little while ago, we have somewhat of a dilemma, right? These things cost money. You know, it's not like going to the store and just getting some shampoo. These things are heavy-duty investments. It's a cost. So how do we balance that cost and the benefit? How do we go to those who are stakeholders, those who are in the C-suite, so to speak, and say, you know what, let's do this. We have to balance these two. That's what they're doing in their heads. They're balancing these two components. What's the cost, and what can I see as the benefit? Is this project worthy of my time, of our time? And that's really the dilemma that we're looking at right now. And the quickest way, one of the ways to meet that dilemma is through ROI calculations, right? This return on investment analysis or calculation. What is return on investment? I like this quote. I recently saw it by Warren Buffett. And it says, price is what you pay value is what you get. So you can pay something, you can pay a certain amount of money, but the value, that's really what holds close to your heart, goes close to your heart. I was at AT&T right before I flew over here in New York. I had to get a new phone, and the salesman, he offered me all of these other things. He said, oh, you know what, you could get a home phone. You can get this tablet. I was like, I didn't really want it. It didn't have much value for me. I don't know the last time I used a home phone. I don't use it. So it has no value to me. It has no resonance with me personally. So the way for these BI projects, these business analytic projects to have a value to those who you're pitching it to is if it's couched, if it's in light of the mission of the organization, right? If it's in line with the mission of the organization, that's what really gravitates or adds value to this particular project. So I think that's a worthy point to mention as we move forward. So a little bit about the science, the nuts and bolts. So we have two components to ROI calculations, and it's really in the name itself. We have the return and we have the investment. So the investment is the resources devoted to a project. Now those resources don't always have to be money. It can be time. It can be sweat equity, whether it be volunteers. It can be a myriad of things that are resources, but that may not have a significant or a easily understandable dollar value associated with it right away. But there's resources that we devote to a project. Now these resources can be at the beginning, or it can be during the project. So we just have to kind of keep that in mind. It's not a one-time investment. It's like a marriage, right? It's a long haul. You just don't do it once. It's a process. It's consistent. An investment has an expectation for return. Yeah, I mean, I like Google, but I want to invest in them because I like the logo, right? I invest in them because I want some return. I want some money back in response to me giving them, buying their stock. That's what I would like. That's my preference. Then we have the return. That's what I actually get as a result of getting into this investment, whatever it might be. So we have these two components, and it's hopefully fairly simple to grasp. So this graph, I hope, highlights a little bit in a graphical way return on investment and where different things lie, right? So the red line is kind of like the cost over time for any type of project. In this case, we're talking about BA or BI projects. So at the beginning, usually our costs are much higher. The blue line represents what we gain as a benefit associated with that particular project. So hopefully it's intuitive in that at the beginning of a project, you're really just giving a lot of money. You're putting a lot of money into it. After a while, you would hope that what you get in return is much more than how much you invested, okay? Now these two spaces, the blue space basically outlines that there's a loss, right? Our expenses are more than our revenue. That orange space denotes that our revenue, how much we're getting for this project, how much money is coming in, is more than the expenses that we've devoted to this project. And in the middle is that break-even point, right? It's something that everybody wants to know about, especially people who are stakeholders in this project. They want to know, at what point in time do I get my money back? At what point in time do I get my money back? I don't want it to be 10 years from now, sooner rather than later. At what point do I get my money back? So that's the first thing, or one of the first things people want to know when we're doing a ROI analysis. So this is perhaps a simple explanation in formulaic terms, ROI analysis, ROI calculation, and this is very basic, and we'll get into the reasons why. First, we have the appreciated investment. How much did you actually gain from this investment? So if I have $100 and I put it in Chase and I get 110 within the space of a year, the appreciated investment is that $110. And then I reduce it by how much I invested, that cost of investment, and then divide it by my cost of investment. And that receives some sort of percentage in terms of my ROI, how much I gained on this particular instrument. So this is a simple explanation. What it doesn't take into account is this idea of the time value of money, right? Money today is worth more than money tomorrow, right? So if payroll came up to you and say, you know what, I'm sorry, but I can't pay you this week, but I got you next month, I think you would be upset, right? Because you have bills to pay, things have to be done now. It can't be pushed off to tomorrow. So that's kind of like a simple explanation behind this idea of net present value, where you want to take those dollars that are in the future and discount them and say, you know what, it's in the future. It's really worth more to me today. How do I begin to adjust my ROI calculation to reflect that? Because that's something that needs to be accounted for as well. So this is the value of future money in today's terms. Right? So it's really the difference between present value cash inflow and outflow. So when I say, that might be kind of like jargon for some people, but when I say present value cash flow, inflow and outflow, it's just money coming in and money coming out. If it's money that's revenue or money that's being generated associated with the project, even though it's 2 years from now, that should be discounted in today's terms. In the same way, money that's being devoted, continuous resources that's being devoted to a project in future years, that should be discounted as well. So you do it on both sides to be consistent. So this is another formula, a little bit more advanced than the basic one that we looked at, taking into account this net present value. And we want to we want to include it on the appreciated investment and the cost of investment. We want it to take into account in all of these spaces. And once again, that net present value is just discounting it. It's pulling things back into today's terms. So we don't have to memorize, I showed a little bit of a formula a while back. It looks, some people may understand it, but we don't have to memorize those specific components. In Excel, there is a function called NPV, or net present value. And we just have to know what to plug in, right? Which variables to put where. And the first variable that it asks for is this annual discounted rate, which is our cost of capital. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then we plug in the values, right? The inflows and the outflows, money coming in and money going out. And from there, we have our net present value calculation. So cost of capital. This is something that many people, I think, miss when they do any type of basic return on investment analysis. They miss this cost of capital. And cost of capital essentially is if you need to borrow $1 million in order to support this project, then that's your cost of capital. If you're borrowing it from multiple places, right? You get private funding from one place, you get some sort of a bank loan or some debt or equity instrument, whatever it might be, then you need to have some sort of composite, right? Some sort of weighted average cost of capital. But it's the same idea. It's if that money costs you money, it costs you to use that money in some way, shape, or form. Whether you get that money from somewhere or you use your internal reserves, that money costs you something to use. It's also used as somewhat of a preliminary measure for project feasibility. What I mean by that is there are other investments that we can put our money towards. We have $1 million. You could put it in the bank if you wanted to, right? If you wanted to get like 0.5% or something like that. You could buy some T-bills and maybe get a little bit more. You could put it in different places that have much more safety than this potential project. So your investment analysis needs to take into account that, right? If you can put it somewhere safer and this project cannot do better than that, why would you do it? It should have a significant return in order to take that level of risk, right? That's the main idea behind it. So if it can't, let's just say that cost of capital was 3%. If it can't beat that 3% return, then there's no point in doing it. I might as well just put it in an instrument, some sort of instrument that can get a safe 3%, right? That project must do better than that preliminary cost of capital figure or number, percentage. So this is a basic return on investment table, somewhat of a table. So before a project starts, let's say we invest $700,000, right? We put $700,000 towards this project. Year one, we add another $1 million. So we're putting money out, we're putting money out. Then we have the net benefit realized. So what I mean by the net benefit realized is our revenue minus our expenses in those specific years. So in year one, we have $500,000. In year two, we have $700,000. Year three, $1 million, so on and so forth. And then we have kind of just the difference between the two, all right? What's that net benefit flow? What's at the end of that year, how much is it? And then we have cumulative numbers as we go out through this project. How much are we gaining or losing through this project? So here we see about $500,000 after 3 years, right? That's this basic analysis. But remember we said we really need to take into account the time value of money, right? This net present value. So this table is same numbers, more or less the same numbers, but now I added in that net present value analysis or component to the formulas. So if you look year one, right? Instead of it being $1 million that I put in, it's more like 970,000 because I discounted it. I'm looking at things in today's terms. I'm seeing if this is something that we should move forward with. And I did the same thing with these net benefit realized. I'm doing the same thing all around. So that return that I thought was $500,000 is really more like 389,000 after I take into account that cost of capital, okay? Another example, if I use another figure for cost of capital, I'm using 10% instead of 3%. So instead of $500,000 or 389,000 or so, now I see 175,000. All right, so that cost of capital is an initial hurdle that I need to surmount, that I need to jump over before a project can be adopted. So a little bit about a timeline, right? We talked a little bit about the science in terms of the mechanics of ROI calculations and just a few pieces, but I want to talk about the timeline a little bit. Before we begin a project, we need to have some sort of a budget. We need an investment budget. We have to come up with how much would this really cost? How much can this really produce in terms of revenue, so on and so forth? I mean, we have to come with those numbers before we even approach management about it. You can't just say, oh yeah, it looks like it's good. I don't think there would be a response to that afterwards. We have to come with some plausible numbers, something to come to management with and say, you know what, this is something that we should adopt, this is how much it's going to cost, this is how much we're going to get back, so on and so forth. So the investment budget can take into account things like the software, it can take into account labor hours, fringe benefits, we also always have to include fringe, and other resources or overhead costs that might be devoted to a project. Then we have a return estimate, how much money could we get back from this? Could we get back from this? Now after this space is where we would present it to management and say, this is what we came up with. You know, what do you think? Should we move forward? So on and so forth. So that's that space right there. Then in the middle of the project, after it's all kicked off and it's adopted, it's ready to go, we should continue to revisit what we initially thought would be our outcomes. It's like we have our original budget, more or less, and we have a revised budget. And we continue to compare for two reasons: to see if we're really in line with what we originally thought, and to manage, right? To manage, because we want that same outcome. If we told management we were going to have a 10% return on our money, we have to make it work, right? So you have to modify certain things, cut back in certain ways, or find new potential benefits. Like, it has to work. So that's why that mid-project checkpoint is helpful, and do that periodically. Now, when the project is done, all said and done, we do some sort of post-project analysis and see where did we fall short, where we did better, so on and so forth. Now, why is this helpful? I mean, it's helpful for this project. It's just a way to manage, but it's helpful for other projects, future projects. Now you have a little bit more expertise that you can use in future projects to make it more efficient, better, so on and so forth. Now, there's two budget development methodologies or processes or ways to build a budget, right? We have the top-down approach and we have the bottom-up approach. So the top-down approach is we have a total cost, right? We have an idea of a total cost, how much it might be, and then we break it down into the sub-levels. We might benchmark other projects internally or externally to get an idea of what that total number should be or could be, and then break it down into its components. We could reach out to industry associations throughout our networks to see if there might be people who have done similar things to get an idea of how much should I be spending on this? What type of return should I get back from this? So that's more of a research aspect of it. I mean, it's a quicker way than this bottom-up approach. I favor the bottom-up approach. Maybe that's just how I think. I favor the bottom-up approach, in where we get all of the details and then build it up, right? I see how many man hours I need. I see who will be devoted to this project, right? You know, how many engineers, how many finance people, what are their salaries, so on and so forth. So I favor that approach, but you can do it either way. It's just about the research and what you have associated with it. But there's two budget development approaches here. So we talked a little bit about the science. I think we spent some time on the science of ROI calculations. I want to talk a little bit about the art. The art is the more creative side of it. I actually favor that side as well. You have a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you look at things that you might include in your ROI analysis. So here, let's jump out of here.
The University of California is, I believe, the largest higher education institution in the world. We have 10 campuses, 5 medical centers, around 250,000 students, about 170,000 employees. The role of the Chief Risk Officer is to focus in on insurable risk, non-insurable risk, environmental health and safety, emergency management, and mission continuity, and also enterprise risk management, which is our overarching umbrella program. One of the things that really drives the needs for analytics more than any other time is the increasing budget constraints. Analytics becomes critical to deploying your resources. We don't have time to go maybe look at every single area every single day, but if we can analyze the data and get that data to the people that are charged with managing those operations, identifying and managing the risk, we're going to be way ahead. The analytics that we use help to look at where the university is going and are we meeting the mission. I'll give you an example of just one use of the whole program and the Cognos system with one group, our police chiefs. So the police chiefs have some reporting they have to do annually. It was taking up a lot of time. Each campus has their own police force. It was taking about 2 people, 3 months out of the whole year. And we used Cognos to take that information and to automate it. And I know that's a tricky word, but basically taking it from a very paper-driven, Excel-type-based process to something that's driving basically almost all of the time out of it. The other in the cost of risk is now they have the information, they can see monthly what's happening, which will help them to deploy resources and know where to focus. On the cost of borrowing, we are, I think, the first non-financial institution in the U.S. to have Standard & Poor's comment that our ERMIS program, again, particularly the Cognos piece, helped improve our ability to borrow, which is a significant savings to the university, and then IT redundancy. Because of the Cognos piece, we are able to avoid purchasing other software components that we would have to. I don't think there's one area or discipline in UC that is in some way not using the tools. The last 6 years, we've been able to reduce our cost of risk from around $18 per thousand of operating down to around $13.43. That represents $493 million. 4 years, we've been able to return insurance costs that we collect, insurance premiums, return about $35 million for the last 4 years to each of the campuses and medical centers, so that money could be used for serving the mission of the university. What excites me about analytics is that it makes you think in a different way. It helps you to think smarter.
So that video was talks about a little bit about the University of California and a project, an analytical project that they're trying to deploy. And there were a few key things in terms of that particular project. They talk a little bit about the budget constraints that they had dealt with. They talked a little bit about the time that is needed to analyze certain figures, analyze certain processes that they were encountering. And they talked about certain savings. They talked about the insurance premiums that they were able to save because of this analytical project, this huge BI project that they had deployed. They talked about the ability to borrow, the improved ability to borrow. They talked about IT redundancy and police labor savings associated with the project. So all of these things they kind of highlighted and can be used as potential drivers for a business analytical project.
What does this glass of wine in Sonoma have to do with these food scraps in San Francisco? More than you think. Because here at the Slanted Door, one of San Francisco's top restaurants, food scraps like these don't go in the trash. They go in the compost bin, where they are picked up by one of Recology's 1,400 trucks and taken to the Solid Waste Transfer Center. From there, the load is taken to a compost field, where it's collected, sorted, and turned into nutrient-rich compost. Compost that Recology customer Inman Family Vineyards uses to help grow its grapes, that turn into wine that Inman sells to clients, like the Slanted Door. All proof that waste can be a whole lot more than trash. In a city like San Francisco with a large population, demanding terrain, and ever-changing traffic patterns, this process would be complicated for even one bin of compost. But what about the 3,000 tons of material Recology collects and routes through the city each day through its 20 distinct recycling programs? Material the company turns into 16 different commodities to be sold to customers around the world. Working with IBM business partner Key Info, Recology uses data to improve operational efficiency.
Recology had challenges in managing their fleet of trucks on a daily basis, and they had challenges in tracking the waste that was collected by all of those trucks. How can they get the same amount of trash collected and to their recycling facilities efficiently in less time?
The field operations staff is really relying on the IT department to be able to provide route information, customer data as efficiently and as quickly as we can. That information that used to take weeks to generate can now be done literally in hours.
With the help of IBM and Key Info, we've been able to mine data that we just couldn't do before. We can identify more types of materials, where they are, the best ways to go get them and get our job done and get closer to zero waste.
In just 10 years, Recology has reduced the amount of trash San Francisco sends to the landfill by nearly 50%, getting closer to the city's goal of zero waste by 2020.
There's a lot of material that needs to be identified, separated. With the help of IBM and Key Info, we are attacking more of it, getting more of it recycled, and we're going to keep doing that until there's nothing left.
So here we had another example or another video of a company called Recology. And Recology is actually a company here somewhere in California. And basically what they do is they collect the city's trash. They bring it to a compost field, and they use the compost or the fertilizer that's generated from that trash, and they use it to grow their grapes, right? They make these grapes that goes into the wine that they eventually bring to sell to the neighboring communities. So it's a large process in terms of gathering these trucks and circling around the city and collecting this garbage. And they use their their IT infrastructure to manage that efficiency, the efficiency of the traffic in terms of managing those patterns. You had a question? No, that's a good question. And in terms of the trash, right? Trash sent to landfill decreased by 50%. That's something that you can, somewhat measure in terms of that's how they measured it. You see there's a certain amount of pounds of trash this year, and this is how many pounds of trash in the next year. This particular thing is a benefit not only to the organization, they're getting certain resources for free that they're using to grow these grapes, so on and so forth, but there's a benefit to the city, right? The city doesn't have this landfill that they have to support. So there's somewhat of an economic benefit. It might smell better too in the city, because they don't have that landfill around there, or not as much. So that's kind of like the economic benefit. There's jobs associated with it. Those people who are driving the trucks, right? These are jobs that have been employed, people who are doing analytics involved with managing that fleet, more or less. Those are jobs that are created as a result of this.
The world of BI and analytics really seems to be a never-ending race. There's so much information available, and more so every day.
The whole point of business intelligence and business analytics is to change how you perform as an organization, and change does not happen without changing people along with process and technology.
It was interesting to realize what analytics could do for Westfield. It's a matter of making the complex simple.
I can remember when I joined the company that it was not all that unusual to sit at my desk with 2 or 3 reports laid out on my desk, trying to compare and match numbers together. It was very paper intensive, and so as an employee of the company, the information was available, but it wasn't always easy to get to.
One of the challenges that we encountered, not really having a strong culture around information analytics and fact-based decision-making, was collectively we really didn't know what we didn't know. We didn't have a shortage of information. We had a shortage of useful information that we could gain insight from.
We could see that we were falling behind. So there was a very clear need of the competitive space. What had been lacking was this vision of how analytics could move our organization forward, and a belief that we could do it.
We need the information internally to make good risk selection and to service our customers. Our distribution channel, our agents, need good information to be able to sell and market our products. And ultimately, to differentiate ourselves in the market, we're looking to use information to help our customers make good decisions and to manage their risk.
And you add all that up, it really requires an organization like Westfield to make sure that we're increasing our capabilities around business intelligence and analytics.
Very early on, we recognized that business intelligence isn't just about building an enterprise warehouse. It's not just about delivering reports. It's also about building an enterprise view of the data, building the structure to govern the process and the data effectively.
So we brought our expertise and some talent to bear there and combined it with IBM's technical expertise in the area of BI and some of their management, and definitely their change management expertise. And that combination and partnership really worked out well.
They were able to talk not in terms of industry moves in the generic sense. They were able to look at Westfield and say, here's what we can do together to make Westfield better. We married those folks up with Westfield University to create classroom training, classroom tools, and distance learning.
Part of the delivery that IBM brought to the table was working with us to think through what is the best way to encourage adoption of the system, to build the skill set among our employees.
Our field people who interact with agents all the time were armed with more detailed information about the performance of the agents that they work with. And so immediately we saw a positive benefit because their conversations with their agents became more meaningful.
The most satisfying thing to me with our business intelligence program is that it's changing the organization. It's helping us make better decisions. The funny thing about it is the more data data we deliver, the greater the demand is for additional information.
And being able to bring together disparate data all into one place makes us a better competitor. This project, like so many other ones, came down to the people and the capabilities of those people and their desire to make us better. And IBM did that.
So this is a company called Westfield, and it's an insurance company. So they employed a large-scale BI project to help them analyze their processes, make better decisions in terms of risks, who should they be offering insurance to, right? Make a better assessment on that, offer their customers better products, targeted products at the right time. So that's what they used this huge BI project for. One of the key words in this particular slide or this particular case study was that change. The change that was needed for the people, the change that was needed for the processes, the change that was needed for the technology. And all of these things involve things like training, risk selection. They wanted to better identify the risks. They wanted to have more targeted product selections. And a lot of these things you can measure right away. How much money did you generate before when you couldn't do those things? And how much money can you generate now that you have that insight? And some of it you can kind of see right away. You could kind of see right away. One of the things that they mentioned, which I thought was interesting, was training, right? Training. So most organizations, the largest part of their budget is their people, right? Probably at least 60%. How much you're paying people to do things, at least 60%. So the better your people are, the more data savvy they are, which is what I had mentioned before, that's helping your organization. There's a cost to it, right? They had to implement some classroom training, some distance learning, things to that effect, but there's also some measurable returns later on. They also are able to make better decisions, and we could quantify those decisions in terms of how much money they were able to generate before, how much money they're able to generate now, so on and so forth. So what makes business analytic projects different from typical or other ROI analysis? I think it's really just one thing. It's information, right? It's the information that we can get through these projects, through this analysis that we couldn't have gotten before, right? That's kind of like, I think that's the overarching theme, is the information. We're living in a knowledge economy, an information society, and whoever has the information the fastest, they win. So this is why this is so important. So there are a few analytical types of projects. They're kind of separated into maybe 3 or 4 different categories. We have the prescriptive types of projects, business analytical projects, and they tell you what to do, right? What do you have to do in order to get to this future state? They tell you specifically what to do. And these have the potential to have the most ROI, the most return on investment. Then we have something called predictive. It just tells you perhaps what's going to happen, maybe what's going to happen. But prescriptive is much better. It tells you what to do. People like to be told what to do in certain respects. But predictive just tells you what's going to happen. Then we have something called a diagnostic, right? It just kind of tells you why it happened. It's kind of like the diagnostic on a car. You have you need an oil change, or your tire blew, you have a nail in the tire. It tells you kind of like why it happened. These are the things that caused this to happen. Helpful, but not as good as predictive or prescriptive. And finally, we have something called descriptive. It just tells you what's going on. It's like a real quick snapshot, maybe like some sort of a dashboard, and says, this is your state at this point in time. But it does not yield the same potential benefits as something like a prescriptive that does all of this analysis and then outlines the steps that you need to take in order to get to where you want to be. So I talked a little vaguely about economic impact, and this is somewhat of an analysis of economic impact, where we have the dollars associated with a BI project or a BA project, that's line 1. And then we have these multipliers. In this case, I'm using RIMS multipliers to get, okay, how much money does this actually generate for the community? how many jobs might be generated for the community, and we're using these multipliers to help us get to that place. And you could also isolate it if you wanted by certain regions and certain respects. So you can take a look at that. I think there may be downloads on the website, so you could get these slides and take a look at it in a little bit more detail. Brand awareness, right? That's perhaps something on the artsy side that we can include in our ROI analysis that we may not typically think about. If an organization, as a result of implementing a huge BI initiative, for some reason is a little bit more well known or is in the media a little bit more often, that's value, right? That's something that can be included as a benefit to an organization. We can measure the traditional occurrences, how often was it being recorded or cited in the media before versus the time period now, and saying, okay, this is a translatable, a definite benefit that we can see right away. We can look at things like social media outcomes, web traffic, all of these things to measure those 2 points in time, like a before and after analysis or approach. And we can convert those measurements into quantitative values, right? Dollars and cents. I think I have one example here. We have, in this example, 10 media occurrences, and I'm saying that this media occurrence is worth $10,000, okay, or $1,000 rather. So that calculated monetary value is 10,000. So that's what I have in this simple explanation. But for every media outlet, it's going to be different. Right? The value of a mention in the Wall Street Journal is different than the mention on maybe a small blog. So I just need to take into account that. I mean, one of the ways to do that, and they have metrics for some of these things, but I think to advertise in the Wall Street Journal is a significant sum, right? Tens of thousands of dollars. We can use that figure as the value of that media occurrence. So that might be a quick example. So a very quick summary of the art of ROI calculations, including things like the economic impact, right, which I think is helpful, which many people don't think about, and which may be helpful when you're talking to your executives or whoever it might be. This not only benefits this organization, but it benefits the community at large, and that can be used as a marketing tactic, so on and so forth. New products being offered. If as a result of this BI project, whatever it might be, you've identified some new markets, some new products that are more specific, more tailored, that's a measurable benefit, and any of the sales associated with that. Improve customer satisfaction through the use of surveys to see kind of like a before and after approach. That's something that's measurable and should be eventually seen in your bottom line. More engagement by your client base and your customers, even your employees. Improve finances. Upgraded bond rating. So one of the examples that I had, which was supposed to be the University of California and a large-scale project that they were able to implement. And as a result of that project, their bond rating improved. So basically that translated to a decreased cost of capital for them. It didn't cost them as much money to go out and get this debt, so to speak. That's something that's of value that we need to include in the ROI analysis, right? It doesn't cost as much. Additional employee benefits. Maybe there might be certain benefits that you're able to offer your employees as a result of this. I mean, those are things that we can include. And of course, better decisions. That's probably like number one. You're just able to make better decisions. In terms of generating ideas, because it's not so limited. I know people often think about just maybe the time savings associated with implementing a BI project or making better decisions. But there's other things that are out there as well. We just have to like dig a little deeper. Sometimes it might take looking at other internal projects and seeing how those fared, or holding brainstorming sessions internally to see what's the impact of this? What's the real impact of this? Looking at the appeal of other projects and saying, okay, what makes this project more likable than another? A lot of people like to support projects that are maybe have a social good, right? That's value. That's perhaps related to brand awareness. But sometimes it's just about sitting down and thinking about it and talking about it with others to get some ideas in terms of mainly the benefits, but also the costs. Because we want to be, this should be something that's true. We don't want to just manage to a number and that we just want to pitch, make this project get adoption. We want to make something get something that's true, that's real, that makes sense. In terms of best practices, and I mentioned it briefly in certain respects, always include fringe and overhead costs when you're doing this ROI calculation. Always overestimate when you can labor costs. It always costs more. It always takes a little bit more time. That's just the nature of these projects, especially capital projects. That's just the nature of them. So be as conservative as possible and gauge a little bit more. Compare to similar projects over a similar time period and see how those fared, what were the hiccups in those projects, and seeing how you can include it in this project. Track periodically against initial investment budget, right? And I think I mentioned that in that budget cycle process, right? Be prepared to defend the value propositions. So if you brainstorm, you come up with all of these ideas, this project is gonna do this, it's gonna help us make these types of decisions, it's gonna save us this amount of money. Okay, that's good. You're gonna have to provide that detail and justify it. Right? So be prepared to justify it with facts, with data. Establish an acceptable return before projects begin. So you want to know at what is the point that I should be getting to for this project to be adopted, right? Where am I trying to get to? What's the end game? So it's only then that we can really see if this is something valuable or not. And that's what that cost of capital kind of does. And there's other ways to do it as well, but that's what that cost of capital kind of does. Establish a committee to review and provide feedback. So one of the projects that we did related to this was we had somewhat of a committee, right? A brainstorming group to look at this and say, does this make sense? Are we moving in the right direction? So that's very helpful, and it's related to brainstorming, but a little bit more involved. The committee would be there from the beginning to the end. So that was, I think, somewhat of a quick run through, a brief explanation in terms of the details of ROI calculations and some of the more softer areas. I apologize for the videos that weren't able to show, but they would bring more bearing to what we're talking about now. But I will open it up to some questions specific to ROI calculations or concerns about it that you might have. Yes? That's a good question. So the question is specific to cloud projects. Are there differences between cloud projects and perhaps others? I think you already highlighted it in that respect, that they aren't as capital intensive, perhaps not as much hardware associated with it, but still very similar. It's still the same components. So whether we're doing ROI calculations for a building that's being built or a software project or some sort of smaller analysis, it's still the same ideas. We're just kind of tweaking it a little bit. Of course, for a building, you need construction workers and things of that respect. But for a cloud project, you may not need those things, but there are still certain labor costs associated with it. There's still some overhead costs. So there's still those basic components, perhaps at a different scale, but it's still those basic components, very similar. Thank you for that question. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Gauge that a little bit. No, that's a good question. So what do we use as that cost of capital number? I think that's a good question and a valid question. We can look at what does it cost right now to borrow something. If I went out to market today and I needed $1 million, how much would that cost? What would that cost of capital be? What would that percentage rate be? And I can use that as a measure. I can see other projects and say, okay, they use this number and use that as a gauge. So I'll look into industries, I'll look into environments, look for similar projects, and see what's a good fit. But it has to make sense. And I think the best way is to see what would it cost me if I needed this money and I needed to borrow it, and saying I'm going to use that as my cost of capital. And that will be my initial hurdle that I have to surmount. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Session evaluations are available online. Please provide as much feedback as possible. They help us kind of improve the sessions going forward, so be as descriptive as possible. And thank you from our partners, Microsoft and HP. Thank you, and the entire conference. Thank you for attending the session. Thank you.